Thank you, Tamar. And it's a pleasure to be back with all of you. If you're rejoining us, welcome back. If you're joining in today for the first time, then welcome and hope to see you again next week. This is, as Tamar said, the third of a four-part series. It's devoted to historical aspects of the story of the Jews of New York City as seen through sites, landmarks, and other visible aspects of the city. Those of you who were with us last week may remember that we talked a lot about the ways in which people inscribe themselves on the landscape of the city. And we talked about a few examples that showed how the Jewish presence in New York in such large numbers, at their height, there were 2 million Jews living in New York City as late as the early 1960s. And Jews inscribed their presence or have left the signs of their presence around the city in various ways. We saw a few examples. Some of them were ephemeral, such as the example I gave you of the massive public funeral of the Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem in 1916, which involved a million people accompanying or lining the route that took Sholem Aleichem's remains from the Bronx through Manhattan across the East River to be buried in the cemetery, of the Mount Carmel Cemetery. And for that day, New York City was, in a sense, a Jewish city with those million people thronging the route all the way along, as I say, through the three boroughs. What we'll look at today are somewhat more permanent and really visible sites and landmarks. Some of them, the ones that we'll begin with today, are possibly less familiar. And even to those of you who may live in New York City, you may not really be familiar with them. And I'm going to start out with one that really might seem to some of you as out of left field, as it were. And the first site that I want to show you is a statue, a fountain in the Bronx in a small park called the Joyce Kilmer Park. It's at the southern end of the Grand Concourse in a park that is about 4 blocks long, 161st Street to 164th. It's about a 5-minute walk from Yankee Stadium, which may be a landmark more familiar to you. This particular statue or monument is dedicated to the poet Heinrich Heine. And here one may begin to ask such questions as, why is there a monument to a German poet in New York City? And thereby hangs a tale. This is a very involved story, and let me begin. But let me also relate quickly to the image of the statue, apart from the sculpted bas-relief image of Heine himself, as you see highlighted. I'm going to use my pointer here to point it out to you right there. That's Heine's profile on the base of the statue. But the statue itself is in the form of a water nymph known in German as the Lorelei. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. Heine was born at the end of the 1790s in the very western part of the German lands in Düsseldorf. It was an area that very soon after Heine's childhood was conquered by the French army under Napoleon Bonaparte, in fact occupied. It's that very western part of Germany that was most influenced by the events of not only the French Revolution, but the ensuing Napoleonic Wars. It was an area where more liberal laws were instituted under the French occupation. And it's that area of the country, incidentally, of Germany that gave us the initial seeds of Reform Judaism, for example, and it also gave birth to Heinrich Heine. Heine, who had been raised in a fairly traditional Jewish family. He was a distant relative of Karl Marx's, by the way. Heine became a young intellectual imbued with some of the more liberal and radical ideas of his day. After Napoleon's defeat his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the more conservative right-wing, even reactionary regimes returned to power in Central and Western Europe. And the people like Heine looked at this with some dismay, which increased several years into the reactionary regime. In 1819, when there were a series of riots, many of them directed against Jews, spread across much of Germany and other parts of Central Europe. Not only that, but right-wing nationalist, mainly student groups, gathered and began burning the books to which they objected strongly because of their radical foreign French-associated ideas. And it was Heine at the time, this budding young intellectual, who very presciently and chillingly wrote, "Dort, wo man Bücher verbrennt, verbrennt man auch am Ende Menschen." That is, there where they burn books, they will end up by burning people as well. So Heine was in what we would call radical tension with the right-wing currents of the politics of his day, especially in the countries that made up what later would make up the country of Germany. And he left in 1831. He left to live in Paris, where he lived the rest of his days. So he was in exile from the German intellectual culture, living in Paris. He was in exile from himself in another sense. While still living in Germany, he tried to obtain a job in the civil service based on his university credentials, but was barred from obtaining such a position because he was a Jew. And although several years previously he had very strongly objected and even had contempt publicly for Jews who would convert for the sake of convenience, he himself took the step, what he called buying the entry ticket to European culture, and he was baptized. So that by the time he arrives in Paris, Heine is twice exiled, once from himself as a former Jew who converted out of convenience and, as we know from his writings, actually regretted it quite a lot, and exiled from his native country. He turned in those years to writing, poetry and journalism. His journalism was tinged by very sharp critiques of the right-wing nationalism that was on the rise in Germany at the time. His poems, however, tended to be lyrical, beautiful, and very well received. And on the slide, if we can have the first slide back, please, the the page, the title page of the first collection of his poems, Buch der Lieder, the Book of Songs, of Poems, appeared in 1827. And actually, and here we begin to get back to the riddle of why is Heine's monument or memorial situated in New York. This first edition of Heine's collected poems actually was published in the United States by a publisher of German literature in the United States. Today we would call it a bootleg edition, because Heine didn't commission this book for publication. Some of his already well-known and popular poems were simply collected by admirers and put out in this pirate or bootleg edition in the United States. Of course, subsequently they were published widely in Europe as well. On this slide you also see a photo of the bust of Heine that now stands over his grave in Paris at the cemetery in Montmartre. His grave was desecrated by the Nazis when they occupied Paris in World War II, and the grave was subsequently restored after the war. But you begin to get the point, I think, that Heine is a kind of a crossover figure. He was a tormented soul who wrote beautiful poetry and very sharp political critique. He was a Jew who felt the need to deny his origins in order to enter the gates of European civilization. And yet he remained a Jew not only in his own consciousness, but also, and this is more to the point of the story of this monument in the Bronx, in the eyes of those who hated him. And there were plenty of people in Germany and Austria in particular who hated him, despite the fact that he was this incredibly popular figure as a poet, many of whose poems were already being set to music. Now, let me just show you, before I tell you the rest of the story, the way the monument or the statue, the Lorelei Fountain, which was placed in this park in the Bronx in 1899, just about 2 years after the centennial of Heine's birth, in an area which was then flourishing and quite upscale. And nevertheless, over the years, the Southwest Bronx became a fairly depressed area. And as you can see in the photo on the left, and I'll just point that out to you, there were years when the entire fountain installation fell into disrepair, was covered with graffiti and dirty and so forth. About 22 years ago, 100 years after the first emplacement of the erection of the statue, it was refurbished, cleaned up, and restored, and that is the way it has remained till today. Now, why is it in New York? We asked at the very beginning, of all places, why not in Düsseldorf? Well, it turns out that the statue, the fountain, was initially intended for Heine's birthplace in Düsseldorf. But the proposal, it was a statue commissioned by none other than Elizabeth, the Empress of Austria. And it was sponsored in part by Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of the German Empire. And yet Heine, although beloved by many, was hated also by many. And in Düsseldorf, after many years of arguing over the questionable taste of putting up a monument to this native son who seemed to have betrayed the fatherland, Düsseldorf, the city authorities in Düsseldorf, refused to accept the gift of the monument. At which point the monument committee turned to another German city, Munich. And after 2 years of controversy in Munich as well, they refused to put the statue in their city. In fact, this became a major anti-Heine campaign. One of the most prominent anti-Semites in Germany at the time, Adolf Stecker, went on record as saying that that Heine's poetry represented a stain on German culture, that the supporters of the monument were haters of Christianity, haters of the church, atheists, and so forth. One of Austria's leading anti-Semites at the time, von Schonerer, simply described this proposed monument as a kosher monument that had no place in the space of German-speaking culture. And so this monument project was rejected by those two cities, and it is at that point that a group in the United States of German Americans decided that they wanted the statue to be brought to the United States, despite the fact that Heine was in disrepute among ultra-right nationalists in Central Europe, in Germany and Austria in particular. In the United States, there was a circle of German American liberal figures. Some of them, indeed, were Jews. Jews were part and parcel of the German American, German-speaking community in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. We spent a lot of time in the previous lecture talking about the mass influx of Jews from Russia and Poland, from Eastern Europe. So today, at least at the outset, I'm going to talk a little bit about those Jews who were already well established in the United States when those East European Jews came. And in New York City in particular, we find the story of the German and German Jewish community intersecting over this question of the Heine Monument. Now, it was not clear sailing for the Heine Monument in New York either. It wasn't intended to be put up in the Bronx. It was actually planned for the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Central Park West, 59th Street, which is those of you familiar with New York City will recognize it as one of the most important intersections or squares opposite the Plaza Hotel. That is the site that was earmarked for the Heine Monument, and it was with the backing of very prominent members of the German-American elite, including Wilhelm Steinway, the famous manufacturer of pianos, and other figures who mounted a campaign in favor of the statue. And in fact, it was Steinway. I'm going to read you just a little bit from the public address that Steinway made at the time to the New York Park Commission in favor of putting up the Heine statue. And he said, among other things, "We were actuated by a desire to honor a great and universally beloved German poet, no less by this desire than by the conviction that it would be in perfect keeping with American citizenship and the broadness of view and sentiment which distinguishes the American people to pay a tribute to the memory of a man who, on account of his progressive and liberal views, incurred the hatred of reactionary powers that ruled Germany, and to whose monument even now, although his songs are sung by millions of his countrymen and have become a precious part of the world's literature, political and race narrow-mindedness refuses a place in the land of his birth." Right? The race narrow-mindedness to which Steinway alludes here is, of course, the hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism, the racial form of anti-Semitism that was on the rise in the 1890s. So that Steinway, is very clear that in the United States, we want to project a different kind of liberalism, a different kind of cultural openness that a figure like Heine, who was both German and Jew, who was a prophet of freedom and liberty and so forth, would find a proper home, perhaps not in his fatherland, but in the United States. And here, of course, the question is why would a German-American group want to do this, quite apart from these sentiments that Steinway expressed? Well, here again, we go back to the question of how do groups of people inscribe their presence on the urban landscape. They do so in part by marking the urban landscape with reminders of their own community and their own culture. And part of this German-American, German-speaking culture, which involved music, it involved art, it involved science, it involved many, many aspects, including, of course, popular beer culture, which was brought to America by the German immigrants. Is as part of that German-American ethnic existence at the time, Jews were, as I said earlier, part and parcel. They figured as members of committees that sponsored these concerts or groups. The social group in New York City that helped to sponsor the statue that eventually found a place in the Bronx, the Orion Society, had begun to admit Jews several years before all of this began to go down, so that it was a mixed social club or association with both Jews and non-Jews. And in fact, when I sometimes teach my students about this particular era in American Jewish history, I often refer to it as the other German-Jewish encounter. Now, as I said, there were some problems over the choice of location. I'm going to show you in a little while what actually does stand at the original location where the Lorelei Fountain was supposed to have been. Some objections were made to the statue in the United States on aesthetic or artistic grounds, but these objections were in the end overcome, partly because of the strong public campaign by people like Steinway. Among other people who were strongly in favor of this Heine monument being brought to New York City was none other than Emma Lazarus, whose poetry and whose story we talked a little bit about in the first lecture, and to whom we will return again next week. Emma Lazarus channeled Heine's poetry for the English reading public in the United States, because she translated a fairly large selection of Heine's poems into English for the American public. And Emma Lazarus identified very closely with Heine, and she, as I say, was one of these proponents of having Heine honored in the United States. The story of the Lorelei is a story of the water nymph of the Rhine River. And among other things, it involves legends of the siren song of the water nymph luring innocent, unsuspecting sailors to their death at the base of the cliffs. These are legends that Heine used in order to write his poem about Die Lorelei, and this indeed became one of his most famous of all songs. It is one of those songs set to music that entered the category of folk song in Germany, even though it's an art song and it has a composer and it has a poet, but it became so very popular that it turned into, as I say, a kind of a basic part of the German folk music repertoire. And I'm going to play for you now a very short part of the opening stanzas of the Ballad of the Lorelei to give you a sense of the musicality of it and the lyrical quality. Those of you who would like to hear the whole song, there are many performances of it available on YouTube and elsewhere. But here is, as I say, a clip including the first stanza of the song. Music, please. The Song of the Lorelei, which inspired the monument in Joyce Kilmer Park. Just a few last words about the story behind the statue. Again, the controversy in New York City about where to place the statue lies behind the decision to move it to the Bronx. Those of you who know Manhattan, the corner of 59th and 5th, will recognize this statue right away. It is the monument to General Sherman of the American Civil War. That is what occupies the site where Heine should have been. But it is only one example. The Heine Memorial is only one example in what I've described as the efforts by different cultural and ethnic communities to inscribe themselves and their experience and their culture on the cityscape, so that, for example, and I could have chosen at least 20 different examples scattered around New York City. There are monuments to heroes of Poland, of Italy. Here you have in picture number 1, the labeled number 1, is the statue erected to the memory of Louis Kossuth, the Hungarian national hero, situated at Riverside Drive and 113th. In Central Park, there are many small busts and monuments. Here is another one devoted to the German cultural tradition. Here in this case, we have a monument or a statue to the honor of the German poet Schiller. So that this is quite very in keeping with the public practice, as it were, the repertoire of ethnic groups in American cities to put themselves on the map, quite literally and quite concretely. And therefore the importance of the Heine monument, although it would be difficult to say that Jews in New York could claim Heine exclusively, he was a shared figure of both German culture and Jewish history. But there are several other important examples that we'll go into now. We've seen a few of them in the earlier lectures. If you recall our talk about Brownsville, which included the Jewish War Veterans Monument to the servicemen who were killed in World War I, and several other examples. So let's continue. I'm going to show you another somewhat less well-known example of a Jewish memorial or monument. In this case, it is the memorial erected to one of the most prominent New York City couples, the family Isidor and Ida Strauss, who went down to their deaths in the Titanic in 1912. And the family Strauss, a very well-known German Jewish family who had come to the United States before the Civil War. You will probably recognize Isidor Strauss most readily if I tell you that he was the co-owner with one of his brothers of Macy's, the department store, as well as co-owner of Abraham and Straus. Ida and Isidor Strauss went down with the Titanic when they gave up their place in the lifeboats so that others could survive. This monument, as you see, there's a sculpture as well as a plaque. It's in a small triangle park at the where Broadway meets West End Avenue, between 106th and 107th Street on the west side. The Strauss family, as I say, was an illustrious, prominent German Jewish family, and very, very well known, not only because of Isidor and his business success and acumen. His brother Nathan Strauss, another co-owner of Macy's, was a very well-known and very prominent Jewish philanthropist, not only in the United States, but he gave quite liberally to Zionist projects in Palestine. In fact, the Israeli city Netanya is named after Nathan Strauss, Netanya, Natan. Their other brother, Oscar Strauss, was at one time the American ambassador to Turkey, to the Ottoman Empire, and then became the first Jewish cabinet secretary in the history of the United States government as the Commerce Secretary under President Teddy Roosevelt. So that the Strauss family were part of what one might call an elite, prominent group of German Jews who not only took up a very respectable position in the in the world of American commerce, public life, and the economy, but also were key figures in leading the American Jewish community during the period between the 1880s and the 1920s, even into the 1930s. Here you see, again, some portrait photos of Isidor and Ida Strauss, and also a cover headline from the Yiddish press at the time, noting in this black banner, Korbones von der Schiff Titanic, the victims of the ship, the Titanic, with prominently displayed the busts of the Strausses. So this is one of the, I think, less well-known, less recognized Jewish monuments around the city. But I want now to move to a theme which I think is more familiar to those of you who are with us this evening or this afternoon. This is a site in Riverside Park in the West 80s where just after the Second World War, the place was reserved as the site for what was meant to become a memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. And indeed, some remains from the Theresienstadt concentration camp. Ashes or remains were brought from Europe to be interred here in Riverside Park at this site, fenced off as you see with a plaque. But as you can see, there is no actual major monument that was ever erected, even though designs for a very imposing monument were solicited at the time. I'll show you a couple of them. It was a major international search for designs for a Holocaust memorial to arise in the city of New York on that site in Riverside Park. On the left, one of the designs that was proposed with, as you see, a memorial wall with an inscription as well as a figurative chimney and what one could discern as kind of a menorah shape attached. Then there's an alternative proposal by the German Jewish prominent architect Erich Mendelssohn, whose design included kind of 2 tablets of the law and a memorial wall and inscription with a large plaza as well. So that these were some of the ideas that were put forward. And they were shelved. After a while, they were shelved because no one, either in New York State or in the Jewish community, could find a way to agree on what was the most proper way to go about this. And so the site at Riverside Park remained this small gated garden, as it were, with the memorial slab on the ground. Some of the objections to the large memorial in Riverside Park also came from Israel, where the Yad Vashem was at the time building the national Jewish Israeli monument to the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. And at the time, it was a political hot potato to reckon with where should the memory of the Holocaust really be commemorated. New York City seemed not to really to be the natural place. The Holocaust did not take place on American soil. Why New York? And here again, we have to go back to this idea that I've been relating to from the beginning of this evening's lecture, and that is the way in which people who live in a city and want the city to reflect their experience and their identity, they inscribe themselves on that city in different ways. And sometimes in this sense, the idea of putting an imposing, very visible and very public monument to the victims of the Holocaust as a feature of Jewish identity, of the Jews living in New York who did not go through the Holocaust, but for them, a Holocaust memorial became, as it were, a kind of reckoning with their own history, their own people's history and experience. There were, apart from the fact that the site in Riverside, in Riverside Park was never actually used for the erection of a large memorial, New York City does have a few other Holocaust memorials. There is the example, one of the smaller examples is on one of the walls of the New York State Supreme Court Appellate Division building on East 25th Street and the corner of Madison Avenue. And as you see here, there's a sculpture, there's a plaque, there is a dedication that ties in the idea of a court of law and the importance of the rule of law and the connection between law and justice, and the idea that what happens when there is an indifference to injustice, that a society, if it protects justice and the rule of law, can hope perhaps to avoid what happened in Germany under the Nazis. Another of the important examples in and around New York City is this sculpture of the Liberator, which is actually across New York Harbor on the Jersey side, as you can see from the photo on the right, from the site of the Liberator statue. You can actually look across the part of the harbor to Liberty Island, so that you can actually see how the placement of the Liberator, dedicated to the American forces who helped in liberating the camps during the occupation of Germany in the course of 1944, 1945, bearing, as you see in his arms, the figure of a victim or survivor of the Holocaust, with the inscribed tattooed number from the concentration camp on the arm of the Holocaust victim. But perhaps the best known example in New York of a monument and memorial to the victims of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, is of course the New York Holocaust Memorial Museum, which you see here in Battery Park. Many of you may have visited it. It includes exhibitions about the life of the Jews in Europe before the catastrophe, the history of the Holocaust itself, and an exhibit about those who survived and the lives that they began to put together again after the war. And this actually is, in a sense, it's the Riverside Park Memorial transformed and moved to a different site downtown. In fact, it is very close to the site that we looked at first in lecture number 1, the Flagstaff and plaque commemorating the earliest Jewish arrival on the shores of the Hudson River back in 1654. Other ways exist of inscribing the Jewish presence on the cityscape. We talked in last week's session about Herzl Street in Brownsville, Brooklyn, but there are other streets with Jewish references. There is the Golda Meir Square in Manhattan, the Asser Levy Place. Those of you who were with me on during the first lecture may remember Asher Levy was one of the earliest Jews to settle in colonial New Amsterdam and later under the British in New York. In fact, the only one of the early Jewish settlers who was both there under the Dutch colony and under the British administration. And you will see here another example in the center picture of the slide. Women's American Ort, one of the important Jewish women's philanthropic organizations, was honored in this particular occasion by having a square named for the organization Ort, and you can see the ceremonial placement of the street sign there being carefully supervised by this New York City cop. The bust of Golda Meir that you see on the right is, of course, on Golda Meir Square in Manhattan, Broadway and 39th. And I'm going to about wind it up here to leave room for questions. And just to note that next week, which is the final session, I'm going to be talking to you around the motif of being in transit. That although today we talked about concrete, marble, very visible and very permanent sites and reminders of the Jewish experience and the Jewish presence, and inscribing the Jewish presence on the cityscape. Nevertheless, cities are places where people come and go, and frequently they go more often than they come. And this transiency, this movement, this impermanence is something that I will address with you as we wind up the series next week. So I will now turn the microphone back over to Tamar to see whether we've got any questions from those of you in the audience.
Okay, I'm going to say something technical before we actually deal with the questions, because lots of people are asking how can they make up your previous lecture, which some might have missed. So the previous sessions are on our website, and if you've signed up to this session, you will also get a link in a few days. So if you've just joined the series and you're definitely right in wanting to make up, everything is on our website, so don't worry. So I have to ask with a question about, a few people asked about the two statues of Heine. You showed that one with the graffiti and the second one after it's been cleaned up. There was a building in the background. Do you know how that building disappeared?
I don't think it actually disappeared. I think it was the way the photograph was framed. There are a number of different photographs of the Lorelei fountain. There is one in which you can clearly see in the close distance the Bronx County Courthouse and prison, which is a daunting looking prison, not a very beautiful building at all. But that's not the building that I think showed up in the photo that I showed earlier. I think I wanted to spare you the image of the Bronx County Courthouse. So I think it was just an apartment building that was close to that street there near 161st in the Grand Concourse.
Okay, well, that explains it. Esther wanted to know if the desire for a Holocaust memorial in the 1950s could have had an element of guilt for not doing enough from the Jews of New York.
I would say no. I would say that this idea that American Jews, and indeed any of the Jews of the free world in England, in Palestine, in Latin America, there is a certain sense in which those Jews who were lucky enough not to be in Europe should have been able somehow to do something, as if they were in charge of some sort of army or government or resources that they could command, and that were not actually under the control of their respective governments. And the issue of whether or not there were things that the various governments, the British, the American, and several other governments, could they have done something earlier to help the Jews of Europe before there was a Holocaust, when it was only a refugee problem in the 1930s? Well, yes, there was plenty that could have been done, but the truth is that lots of Jewish leaders and organizations were pressing for exactly that, that something should be done. Parenthetically, in light of what we talked about earlier today about the way in which liberal German Americans in the United States and Jews cooperated with one another to some extent, in the 1930s, among the chief proponents of bringing Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany before the Second World War began. In fact, a particular plan to bring Jewish children into the United States outside of the U.S. immigration quotas, it was sponsored by the United States Senator from New York, whose name was Wagner, Robert Wagner, who was from a prominent German-American family, not Jewish. At any rate, lots of people were involved in the 1930s and into the early years of the 1940s in proposing plans and trying to press members of Congress and members of the administration on this issue of Jewish rescue. None of them, as we know, actually helped very much. And so naturally, when one comes out of such a terrible, tragic situation, feeling a certain amount of guilt that things that might have been done were not in fact done. But if there's guilt to be distributed here, it isn't actually to be laid on the Jews, it's to be laid on their respective governments. And therefore, I'm going to answer the question finally by saying it wasn't guilt in terms of the Jews' own actions or inactions that spurred the Jews in New York to create a Holocaust memorial as early as 1946 and 47. It wasn't out of guilt, it was out of a feeling of a shared tragedy of what had befallen the Jewish people.
Okay, I have another question from Alan Teller. He said that near the Holocaust Museum in Riverside Park is a plaque commemorating the Nazi destruction of a Czech village called Lidice. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
Can you say anything about this and its relation to the existing memorial?
It has no specific relation to the existing memorial, but it was one of the worst German atrocities committed during the war. It was committed against, it was a massacre of an entire village, Lidice, in what was then Czechoslovakia, today the Czech Republic, in retaliation for the assassination of one of the top Nazi officials then in charge of what the Germans called the Reichsprotektorat, the protectorate that they, as it were, set up on the land of Czechoslovakia, of the Czech part of Czechoslovakia that they incorporated into the Third Reich. I don't think, as far as I know, there is no direct connection between the two separate memorials in Riverside Park, but the fact that they are close to one another, I think makes it an interesting experience for those visiting the site to reflect on the fact that that other people also suffered under the German occupation, without making any particular comparison here, but the actual juxtaposition does make it clear that the entire war was a terrible tragedy for the human race. 60 million people were killed in the Second World War, 60 million, and out of those, 1/3 were soldiers, and the rest were civilians. And therefore, the closeness of those two sites in Riverside Park, and I thank you for pointing that out to us, I think it's an important thing to bear in mind.
Okay, I'm going to take one question. It was a shorter one. Could you give a few names of other prominent Jewish names in early New York, like the Strausses and Steinways?
Steinway wasn't Jewish, but apart from the, I mentioned one of the important Jews of the German Jewish community in New York City during an earlier talk. It was Schiff. And the Marshalls and let's see, I have to think back now to my 19th century history. There was a whole coterie of prominent, well-established Jewish families. Bloomingdale's is also a product of one of the German Jewish families of that time. As you can see, they were very well placed in the world of commerce. Jacob Schiff as a financier on Wall Street, as well as a major philanthropist, Nathan the Strausses, whom I mentioned earlier. They were a fairly illustrious crowd, and they seemed to have lost their leadership stature, partly because in the end they were simply vastly outnumbered by the East European Jews who immigrated in the subsequent decades and more or less were able to take over the reins of Jewish community life and organizational life by the 1940s and 50s.